along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, every night.
I'm Andrew Nicholl.
And today on the show, we're kicking off a new series specifically geared towards people who are just getting started in the property market. And I'm talking about just getting started primarily as investors. So today we're going to be talking about where are all the cheap properties at. And we're going to go through and we're going to talk about where you can find some cheap properties, even if you live in the major centres. Now, this really is geared towards people right at the start of their journey. And this comes because Andrew and I, we've been working on our book that we've been beavering away on at the moment. And just as a reminder, the way we're structuring it is about the three main life cycle stages. So people who are just starting out, what we call the starting blocks, people who are then running the race kind of in the middle of their phase of wealth building, and then people who are crossing the finish line, winding down for retirement, looking at yield. And for people just getting started, I know you guys have been asking this for a while. So what I wanted to do before waiting until the book's released, I wanted to test these ideas out. And then if you decide you like them or this you think this is quite good advice, send us a text and let us know. We'll put it in the book. If you think it's terrible, we won't put it in the book. But let's start just by recapping what the two strategies are for people who are just starting out. Look, usually the issue that you've got is equity. You don't have enough deposit to go out and buy a couple of different properties. And so you've got two options. You can go out and start renovating properties to manufacture more of that deposit and recycle it out, or you can save and pay down your debts more aggressively or save up a deposit more aggressively to go and purchase a couple of properties. And this is like if you don't own your first home yet. This is people who own no property yet. And the renovation strategy, which we're really focusing on today, is about buying a property cheaply, renovating it, and either selling it in order to pull that deposit out, paying whatever taxes you need to, and going to buy more properties, or refinancing it in order to be able to go ahead and pull that deposit back out, go purchase the next one. And actually, it's quite funny, Andrew, that when we were writing this just over the weekend, we gave an example in the book of a 400k house, just as an example of something cheap you might buy. And then I said, people are going to hammer us for this, but they're going to say, where can you buy a 400k house from? Which actually brought up the idea for this episode of, well, where are all the cheap properties at? Because it's interesting looking at the distribution of New Zealand house prices, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So the average price in New Zealand as of today is $906,500. And the median sale price is $820. Do you just want to explain the difference and how you can get a difference here?
Yeah, sure.
That doesn't understand that.
Yeah, sure. So the average value in New Zealand is you go and you value all of the properties that are out there, using CoreLogic data or Velocity data, and you take the simple average of them. You add up all of what they are, divide it by the number of properties you've got. Sweet, that's your average. Now, the median is often slightly lower than that because what you do is you line up all of the properties in a row and you take the middle one. So if I had 11 children and I lined them all up in a row, I'd take number 6 in that case, which is the one right in the middle. And I'd say, well, how tall is that one? Now, the reason that might be lower than the average is that if I've got one kid who's 7 foot and is an absolute giant and the rest of my kids are 2 years old, then the oldest kid, who's maybe 18, let's say, I'm just pulling numbers out of the air.
This is such an amazing example that I'm glad that I asked you to tell the difference.
Is this a bit convoluted?
No, it's good.
No, yeah. So if I've got 10 short kids, because they're all under 5, and I've got an 18-year-old that's 7 foot, then he's going to pull up the average. But the median is the one right in the middle. So even it doesn't matter how tall my eldest child is, it's the median one that really matters.
I really like that you've got 10 under 5, like the true economist that you are.
Well, the other thing I never would because it'd mess with my servicing, of course. The other thing that's interesting, just applying that to house prices. So if you've got a couple of properties that are $30 or $50 million houses, they will pull up the average, but that's not necessarily the property that's right in the middle.
It's not a good representation of the middle.
Even beside that, I think the argument we're kind of advancing here today is that, which we haven't even got into yet, is that the average and the median are not always what you should be looking at.
Which leads into my next point, thankfully, now that Ed's finished with his children, and that we see most of the activity in the 600 to the 699 price band. And over the 6 months that we looked at these numbers, which was start of this year to mid this year, there were 3,867 or 8.4% of the properties sold which were less than 400k, and that excludes bare land.
Yeah, so there are properties in New Zealand, about 8.5% of them, that sell really, really cheaply. And when we're talking about most activity, what we're really talking about is that if you think of a distribution, of New Zealand house prices, it's not a perfect bell curve. Do you know what I mean? What I mean by that is it is skewed to the cheaper end. So there are lots of properties that get sold at the cheaper end of the New Zealand market, but then you have a lot of properties sold at the higher price bands. And so we're going to go through each of the four main centres and talk about what the distribution of property prices are, where we see most activity, and then we're also going to talk about where you might find something even cheaper. Now, I know what some of you long-term listeners are thinking, though, just before we do that. You guys have spent the last 700 episodes on telling me that I should buy in decent areas where I'm going to get some capital growth. And I would say, yes, you absolutely should, and would still recommend that, if you can. But if you're just starting out, if you don't have your own home yet, if you haven't started paying down a mortgage, if you haven't got some capital growth, you might not be able to do that. If you're just starting out, what you might have to do is buy a property. Let's say you live in Auckland. You might have to buy a property in Huntly really cheaply, get access to a 10% deposit, treat it as your owner-occupier, commute to your job in Auckland for a bit while you renovate that property for 6 months, and then you might have to go move back to Auckland after that 6 months is up, and you've passed the time where you would need to live in the property to get your KiwiSaver out legitimately. So you might have to make some of those sacrifices if you're not able to get into the Auckland market and you don't have your first property yet. And so I guess that's what we're really talking about is, well, how do you just get a start? Speaking of Auckland, walk us through kind of the distribution of property prices and, what sort of activity we see at the lower end of the market.
Okay, so the average house value in Auckland as of today is 1.284 million. The median, as before in the example of New Zealand, is lower at 1.15 million.
So both pretty expensive.
Absolutely. But the bulk of the activity we've seen in this 6 month period again is between the 800 to 899 price band.
So I think it is important to note that just over 10% of properties in Auckland in that 6 month period sold for between 800 and 900k. And just about over 8% of properties, again, sold between 700 and 799k. And I guess what we're really trying to say is, what we've always seen on the show, you don't have to buy properties that are the median price.
Absolutely.
You don't have to buy properties that are the average price. You can buy at the lower end. And it's interesting that about 3% of properties in Auckland sold between 500 and 599. Now, I can already hear what you're saying, but Ed, those are going to be apartments. Yes, 100%. There are going to be some apartments in there, but there are probably some 2-bedroom units that are being sold between 700 and 799 in very South Auckland or very North Auckland. And if you have to make a sacrifice and purchase something that's not your ideal house or not your ideal first rental property in order to just get on the market, live there for a bit, do up the property, pull out your equity and then go rent where you actually want to live, that might be something that you're willing to do just to make that first start. But what I also want to say is, let's say you can't afford that 700 to 900k mark, even though we see a lot of activity in there. Maybe you might look further afield. Maybe you might look to the Waikato district, which is where Huntly and Ngāruawāhia are. And we've spoken about Ngāruawāhia on the show in the past. And again, I want to talk about how cheaply you might be able to buy a property there. So the average house price in the Waikato district is 680k. Median house is 785k. But the price band with the most activity is between 400 and 499k. So we see over 14% of properties in the Waikato district, not the Waikato region. These are actually different. There's the region that's Waikato, and then there's a council area which is just south, directly south of Auckland. That's the Waikato district area, and we see a lot of properties selling between 400 and 499k, and in fact 6% of properties sold between 300 and 399k. Again, I know what you're going to say. You say, "Oh, Ed, it's going to be a terrible house." Yes, but if that's what you need to do to get into your first property and you don't want to wait, then that might be a sacrifice that you're willing to do if you want to live there for a bit, commute to Auckland to go work there. Maybe you stay 3 nights a week in Auckland and then live in your Huntly property for 4 days a week, realising that in that case you're still living there the majority of the time, and so pulling out that KiwiSaver is kosher in that instance while you renovate that property. That might be a sacrifice you're willing to do. Let's talk about the Dunedin market. Where are the cheap properties?
So this is a bit more interesting. So the average house value there is 655. Median is 610. Most of the activity is actually between the 600 and the 699 price band. But there's still quite a lot of activity underneath that band. So there's about a third of the activity is between the 400 and the 599 price band. So I've grouped two together to get that, but that works out to be about 35% roughly of just in that price bracket, which I imagine is lots of, first home buyers.
Well, it's quite amazing that still 15% of properties, or just under, in Dunedin are selling between that 400 and 499, and we've got about 6% of properties selling between 300 and 399. So there definitely are cheap properties out there. They might not be great properties, but you still can buy something out there. And if you are purchasing as an owner-occupier, even if you intend to flip it over to an investment, you might be able to purchase with a 10% deposit and use your KiwiSaver as long as you live there for the first 6 months. Alternative to that, if that's still too expensive or you're not able to find the right property, you might head down to the Clutha district. So this is an hour south of Dunedin. Main city there, or it's not a city, it's a town of 4,000 people, is Clutha. Average house value there is 367k, median house is 420, and you see about 33%, a third of properties in Clutha district sell between 300 and 399k. To put that into context, let's say you purchase something in the middle of that, 350k. Well, if you're purchasing with a 10% deposit, you're only going to need a $35,000 deposit. Now, if you're able to get 5k of that from the first home grant, and again, you're purchasing it as an owner-occupier, and then you'll flip it into an investment, you might be able to get a maximum of 5k if you're purchasing on your own, depending on how long you're contributing to KiwiSaver, and then you pull out the rest of your KiwiSaver, might be 20k, then you only need $10,000 worth of cash to purchase that property. Now, bear in mind as well that you are also going to need to fund the renovation costs, and we're actually going to talk about purchasing with a low deposit in tomorrow's episode. But there are properties that you may be able to buy even if your home city is relatively expensive. And actually, speaking of your specific home city, Andrew, let's talk about Christchurch.
So Christchurch has got an average house value of 300. So Christchurch's average house value is 631,000. Median house sale price was 580. Most of the activity is happening in the 500 to the 599 price band, but again, significant activity happening underneath that. So, for example, the 400 to 499 price bracket, you got 20% of the activity happening there. It does drop off significantly after that. So, 300 to 399, you're probably only about 9%. Interestingly, so it tails off really quickly in Christchurch. So as soon as you get to kind of the $1 million mark, very limited amounts of sales happening there as a percentage. And, you go to the 2 million plus, you might be 2% it roughly looks like, whereas in Auckland, 10% still.
And I think the interesting thing there is once you get to those higher values, of course, it naturally starts to spread out, because if something's 1.1 versus 1.2, as a percentage, it's not a big difference. You know what I mean? Now, the other interesting thing is, well, what happens if Christchurch is too expensive for me? Well, the closest, most affordable district, and this is actually what we're going through with each of these kind of alternatives, is we've looked at, well, what other districts are around and what is the area that has got lots of cheap properties that you could potentially go look at. And the one for Christchurch is Ashburton. So the average house value there is 448k, median house value or house sale price of 415. But we see a significant amount of activity. 35% of houses in the Ashburton district over the 6-month period were sold between the 300 and 399k price bracket. So same as Clutha in that instance, or the Clutha district. And let's just let's move on to the last one. This one's a bit tougher because in Wellington, basically everything's very expensive in the surrounding districts.
Although it is almost a perfect bell curve. It's quite satisfying looking at the distribution there. So in Wellington, your average is 1.14 with a median of 1.035. Most of your activity is between the 900 to 999 price bracket, but only slightly less in the 800 to 899 price bracket. And even if you go the kind of 500 to 599 and 600 to 699, you're still talking about 12% between the two of those.
Yeah, so it's amazing that 12% of properties still sell between 500 and 700K. Yeah. Now, I know what you're going to say, because we've taught you too well to be data nerds. You're going to say, well, how many of those are apartments? Look, we could get the data and split it out and just look at houses. And some of these might be apartments. But the key message here is there are cheap properties on the market. And I think one of the big things that I just want to get across is that so many people, when they're doing an analysis of the property market, will look at averages and medians, but that's not necessarily what first home buyers are necessarily purchasing. The alternative for you is probably the Masterton district is the cheapest one within the Wellington region. Average house value there 610. Median's about the same, but we see a significant amount, about 27% of properties in Masterton district were sold between 500 and 599 over that period. Now, that's still quite a bit of coin there. I mean, it's still a bit of cash. It's higher than the other ones, all the higher alternatives that we've talked about. But that might be where you want to purchase your first property, renovate it, then move back to Wellington City 6 months later, just so you can get started and have your first home there. So hopefully this has given you some good food for thought. And I think we're going to have to do an article showing these distributions in the graphs as well, Andrew, because I find this sort of stuff really fascinating. Now, on tomorrow's show, we're going to be continuing on with our series about people who are just purchasing their first home as an investment. And we're going to be talking about how to get low deposit loans and some definite things you need to be looking out for if you are purchasing with a low deposit, purchasing as an owner-occupier, turning it into an investment. And of course, if you want to learn more about property, make sure you turn up to our next webinar. That's happening Tuesday, 17th of August. We're going to be talking about getting money, how to get money from the bank for your first investment property, and then how to get more money from the bank so that you're able to go from 2 to 5 properties and beyond that. That's going to be with our mortgage advisor and friend, Peter Norris. He's going to be joining us in the studio down here. Want to come along to that? Tap or swipe over the cover art. I'm going to put a link down in the show notes, or just go to opuspartners.co.nz. You'll find it on there. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Evan Knight. I'm going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.